Hello and welcome everyone to this session of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding Annual Conference. Over the past 4 days, the SVNP, together with you, our invited guests, has been unpacking business unusual. A rapidly changing world calls for adapting peacebuilding in Africa. In this session, we focus on youth and the future for peace and security. I am Otilia Anamaunganidze, and I head special projects in the Office of the Executive Director at the Institute for Security Studies. The ISS is one of 22 African policy and research organizations that work with the Wilson Center Africa program to bring African analysis and perspectives to key issues in the US-Africa relations. The project itself is funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York since 2011. So this is our 11th year in existence. As the chair and moderator of this session, I chair and moderate with the benevolence of a person who has lived under dictatorship. That means, to my panelists, 8 minutes is no more than 8 minutes 1 second. You are allowed to have 7 minutes 59 if you like. It means, to those of you in the room, both virtual and in person, please, in order for us to have a robust discussion, you can comment, you can provide input, you can ask your questions as succinctly as possible. If the panelists have no more than 8 minutes, it follows that you have no more than 4 in your input. Allow the panel time to digest your questions and then to respond. As I mentioned, the session focuses on youth, peace, and security. Don't be swayed by the fact that the chair and moderator is not youth, nor that Père Hyacinthe Lua is also not youth. Agostinho, just post-youth. But Ramatuli Satujalo, definitely youth. This conversation is about engaging the substance. We recognize, particularly on the African continent, where the median age of our heads of state is the retirement age of those countries. We recognize that the solutions that need to be crafted to respond to crises on the African continent are not about including youth in the conversation. Youth are Africa. Africa, as the youngest continent in the globe, currently sits at a median age of 18.8. That means 50% of the African continent is below 18.8. Of the remainder, the majority are between 18.8 and 50 years old. It's a young continent by the people of that continent. It means that young people need to be shaping a lot of the policies and practices that affect them directly. Our conversation today will speak to that. We'll speak to the ways in which young people have been able to shape peace, security, democracy on the African continent, whether it's through mobilizing to vote for elections, such that in Zambia, a turning point on who heads the state was essentially fueled by the actions of young people. Whether it is in Nigeria, we're fed up by the ways in which the security apparatus was impacting safety and security instead of providing it. People started a protest, a wave both on the ground and virtually, to end SARS. But this also speaks to frustration. It speaks to young people not getting access to resources, to spaces. It speaks to poverty and inequality and marginalization. It speaks to us talking about bringing young people into the room when young people in Africa are the house. That we need to be looking to shaping the right kind of responses such that young people are not the majority of perpetrators of violent extremism. That young people, frustrated by their states, are not taking to riots to respond to those concerns. to crime, to other ways to make ends meet. So, panelists, I'm asking you, if you're not young, to speak to how best to engage the youth, to speak to ways in which you have been inclusive in your work. If you are young, to speak to the innovations that come from being a young African, to share with us some best practices, some hurdles, and in the spirit of business unusual, to buck tradition in the way in which we speak about these issues. So we are going to have a conversation. Now that I've used my 4 minutes, audience, please take your cues. Now that I've used my 4 minutes, we're going to hand over to our panel. They will speak for about 25 minutes, which will provide us double that time for discussion. Our conversation starters are Père Hyacinthe Lua, Ramatuli Satu Jalo, and Augustinho Ting Mayai. Each of the speakers, as I said, will offer 8 minutes of initial remarks. I will introduce them in turn. So our first speaker, and we're going in descending order of age, is Père Hyacinthe Lua. He is a Jesuit priest born in Zerekore in Guinea-Conakry. After his university studies in philosophy, sociology of development, pastoral theology, and systematic theology, as well as history in the Congo, Burkina Faso, Kenya, and Canada, Father Lua has been the Deputy General Director and is currently the President of SERAP, Jesuit University in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. Père Lua, je vous donne la parole.
Thank you very much, and thank you. The theme here is the youth and the future of peace and security in Africa. And I will focus on the experience of SERAP. SERAP is the Center of Research and Action for Peace. I always say we have to underline research, action, peace. And before I go ahead, I would like to start by a story. In 2011, I organized a workshop in one of the villages in Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, and there were many people, but most of them were they were not young. And I was talking about peace and peace culture and how to deal with, how to work for peace. And there was a man, an older man, and he stand up saying, Father Lua, you are talking about peace, and you are talking about also the culture, the way we have to live peace in this area, but I'm not seeing the door. And I say, the door? He said, yes, but in the house has a door. I say, okay. And I was wondering, and he told me, there's no youth here. Where are the young people? Because those are the ones who are going to cultivate, who are going to tell people how to live peace in their area, in their homes, and in their villages. And as you also know, that our man, Nelson Mandela, used to say that education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world. And in SERAP, we used also to say that the means of our goal, the means of what we want to do is education. So my experience will be based on education, how we educate people, the young people, in order to be the actors of peace, actors of reconciliation in their villages, I will say, even in their families. We start in the families, to the villages, and then for the nation. On this line, SERAP has decided, SERAP, that the university, has decided to use the weapon to build, that weapon is education, to build a culture of peace among the young people. And it's about to create and maintain a climate of peace through dialogue. And this is very important. Before I go ahead, I always say that it's very good to understand the background of my own experience in peace building. The background is very important. For the leaders of SERAP, African youth are the future of a peace building process. This is our conviction that emerges from our peace building experiences in the country. As you here, you know Côte d'Ivoire. That country has experienced several periods of social political crisis that had destabilized national unity and worsened the economic situation of the youth. Indeed, as you may know already, the political crisis of 2010 and 2011 was essentially electoral. That was a period of misinformation, as a period of individual and ethnic manipulation by those who were fighting for the power. In this period of crisis, many young people were used either to scare others or to amplify violence between ethnic groups. Then the youth were used by the politicians, by those who wanted to get the power. For example, I will give you, in Côte d'Ivoire, people used to talk about the microbe. Microbe, it's a microbe, that's the name of young people who are, they call them, those people, they are street kids or street children. But in fact, those are young people who do not have job. They are very poor. And then people are using them when there is a, what we call electoral crisis, and they use them so that they go everywhere, and people are afraid of them. And when they are out, people do not know what to do, and those are youth. In this case, there is a kind of a narrative. They say that in that context that the youth are drivers of conflict. So the youth are creators of instability as opposed to those who want to do peace. So when you have this kind of stigma somewhere, and when you say you are youth, people may look at you, what can I do with you? So, as you may know, in this context, we are dealing with what I used to say, vulnerable. In this, it's among this vulnerability that SERAP has decided, as a part of its educational mission, to focus on education for a culture of peace in everywhere, not only in Côte d'Ivoire, but in West Africa, because we used also to work in Guinea, Burkina Faso, even in Mali sometimes. This education is only a process of promoting the knowledge, values, attitude, and skills necessary to bring about changes. How to change the mind of people, how to change the behavior of people. That's very important. And for that, we got a good project in 2011. That was a project of reconciliation. Then we used to create in each school, we visited more than 50 schools, and we created what we call a space of peace. That is a place where teachers, students may come together with one of our leaders from SERAP, and they discuss about cohesion, for instance, about reconciliation, for instance. And from there, they were using it as a kind of putting in practice what they have learned. And this was very important. Then we were supported by many people, helping us, asking us even to come to their schools to do the same project. We were even invited in Chad for this project. From that experience, I'm seeing some progress in providing them with training opportunities to take an active part in building. Many youth or many young people are now taking today. They are now taking good initiative in terms of building cultural peace in the places where they are living. We do not need them to go to the capital city, but they start in their families and their villages, and then they talk about peace and create a group of peace. Most of them are now working with what we call organizing peaceful movement. There are peaceful movement even everywhere, and we help people to create those movements. And those who are working with us, and they have been trained by Sarah, they belong to this kind of movement. There are also some volunteers in community activities. We help them to be involved in community activities, to be involved in developing their own communities. It's very important because their parents can listen to them. That way they say the youth are the door of the peace culture. I have to go. After this, it is also good to understand that there are some little, I will say, limits, because most of our youth, they created a movement, but they are not supported by the financial activities. And this is very difficult for them because some of them do not know where to get the financial support. Again, most of them now, if they have a mean, they want to talk, they are obliged to go through some leaders so that the leaders can help them in order to achieve their goal. And this is not good for the youth. They must be more free. They must be open to. I can stop here.
Thank you very much for a nice way to put a full stop. Of course, I gave Père Hyacinthe a little bit more time to speak because the clergy are so generous to us that at the very least we can give them an extra 2 minutes. Dr. Agostinho Tingmayai, you're not the clergy. He is a managing director of the Sud Institute. He holds a PhD in sociology with concentrations on demography and development from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He currently studies how state effectiveness affects child health outcomes, with a particular focus in South Sudan and Ethiopia. Before I hand over the floor to you, this is to our entire audience, but also to our panelists. Do remember that this event is being live streamed, and we're also live tweeting today's event. So we will be taking some questions online. Those of you that are in the physical room that would rather also share your input via text, you're invited to do so. Those that are online, please remember to join the discussion by tweeting at Africa Up Close using the hashtag Peacebuilding in Africa. To ask a question, you can tweet it to us, or you can use the chat box function on the event webpage. I then hand over to you, Dr. Agostinho. You have 7 minutes and 59 seconds.
Thank you very much, Otelia. I note that I am not a priest or associated with anything to do with clergy. I completely understand what that consequence means. I am delighted to be here. I last came to such an event in 2015, hosted by, of course, the Wilson Center. The Sud Institute has been a member of this network for the last 7 or 8 years. And it's such a pleasure to be here to meet with you. Majority of you I haven't met before, and to participate in such a discussion. I am asked to present on youth and their contribution in an African society in terms of peace building. And it's not an area that I have explored much. So what I am to present to you in the next 6 minutes is basically perhaps a regurgitation of what others have already said. And I apologize for that. As it has been presented almost everywhere, Africa is a useful continent with its median age roughly being in the 20s. What this really means in the context of specific countries is that if you look at Uganda, half of its population is literally children who are ages 15 or younger. What that basically means is that Uganda is economically burdened because of its high fertility. Too many mouths to feed, and of course that is threatening in terms of progress. So there is a stagnation as a result of having this many young people in the population. What this really says is that the framing of the youth demographic and their contribution to the African society is that which is typically negative. And from this perspective, the African young people are only good at eating up everything that it's available when they are children and destroying whatever is left as young adults. You can look at that, again, using Uganda, where there's a high fertility. So we're saying economic progress is limited in Uganda because of high fertility, but also have this, the Bobi Wine political factor. Bobi Wine is relatively young. I'm sure he's probably younger than me. And he has stirred up the political scene, and people have died in Uganda as a result of his political activities. The youth then are considered, in this context, a tragedy rather than a blessing. And this designation comes from a repeated, dreaded experience, which is underlined by three things, or phenomena. Number one is that youth are not necessarily useful in the African context because they are recruited by political elites to advance their agenda. What that does is that the youth are easily manipulated and captured. As opposed to contributing to society positively, they are used negatively by the political leaders. And so what they do is maim, kill, and destroy on behalf of the politicians. But there's also the absence of state, which is talked about, but I thought this could be brought to bear on this conversation, is that oftentimes the African state does not provide both physical and social protection for the citizens, including the youth. In such cases, the youth are likely to use violence in order to get access to resources and be given attention. And so violent protest, as well as cattle wrestling, I mean, I don't know how this is relevant to you, to the rest of you, but I come from a country that is largely, whose economy is cattle and agriculture. And so for me to get food, if I don't have it, I'm going to go next door and wrestle some cows. And this is quite prevalent in much of East Africa. Or have this nature of competition over natural endowments, natural resources. So the reservoirs for cattle grazing, for example. Uganda, South Sudan, and Somalia are good examples. What this begets is a state of nature, and you know what that means. The most fit survives. And then the third phenomenon is lack of economic activity. This brings me to the point that the father made earlier about investment in human capital. Being a Jesuit priest, he knows better about the importance of education. And I thought I would echo that as well. What this really takes us to is that human capital factors are very essential in terms of skill development that would empower individuals to generate economic opportunities for themselves, or if they are generated by others, they are able to capture them. And economic opportunity, in this case, addresses the issues of material constraints. That low human capital thwarts access to economic activity. And so you need to invest in human capital in order to get rid of that. Unless you are Steve Harvey, right? You don't have to be educated if you're Steve Harvey, right? In this respect, troubled places such as Mali, South Sudan, Niger, Chad, Sierra Leone are seen from the perspective of lack of advancement in terms of education. And so literacy rates are relatively lower there. But let's not focus on those skills and education alone, that they will always be the magic bullet. they're not in some cases. So improved human capital, absent of sufficient labor market opportunities, is also risky. Look at South Africa, right? Literacy rate there is 95%, but the youth unemployment rate is about 60%. So that's education really help? It doesn't. If you look at the Arab Springs, it's all underlined by the fact that a lot of youth have been educated, no opportunities. And so if you have a country that is investing in education and human capital development, but does not build inclusive industries for the youth, then it ends up breeding a legion of educated troublemakers. And that's a problem across Africa. So business as usual. From this standpoint, underlying interventions that have been rolled out always are designed to mitigate the consequences or prevent destructive nature of the African youth. Kenya, for example, there was a program designed by USAID. It's called Yes Youth Can, a program that then empowered 1 million Kenyan youth to expand their economic activities, contribute to their communities, and become responsible members of society. And that underline responsible. The reason responsible is here is because the African youth are not seen as responsible enough. So you need to turn them into responsible elements of a society. And through this program, you have youth being actually organized as their own government. The parliament is what's called the bunge. So my brother from Kenya would provide more perspectives on this. This brings me to what the architectures, the continental and international architectures are saying about the youth. If you look at APSA, which is the African Peace and Security Architecture, limited attention is given to the African youth. What that does, it says, you done? I can stop, actually.
You can say your last sentence.
All right.
I'm not that bad.
You are bad, but it's okay. I will end it here. But so the continental architecture encourages the member states to do right by the youth. It does not oblige them. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
You see, when you give someone only 30 seconds to round up, they make the most sense. The continental architecture, Dr. Augustino Tingmayai says, provides a framework, but not necessarily the means to ensure that youth are an integral part of the African peace and security architecture in reality. So thank you for that, and thank you for the last 30 seconds of your presentation. Both the Sud Institute and SERAP are also members of the SVNP. So on this panel this afternoon, 3 of the 22 African organizations that make up the SVNP are represented. That did not impact my generosity in any way. Our next speaker is Ramatuli Isatu Jallo. She is an emergent youth peace builder from Botswana and the Gambia, with a keen focus on conflict prevention in Africa. She's an attorney with 5 years' experience in civil and public interest litigation, as well as on human rights. Somehow, while studying law, while practicing law, and currently doing her master's at Georgetown, she managed to found the Peace by Peace initiative in Botswana. So if you think that youth are not doing something productive, Ramatuli is here to tell you that they are. To right the great wrong of the fact that our day-to-day started off with a panel comprised exclusively of men, discussing economic integration, the private sector, and peace building, as if women are not integral to the economy, the private sector, or peace building. Ramatuli, the only member of this panel that is not a man, will be afforded an additional 2 minutes to speak.
Very gracious. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I think what's been interesting from the previous speakers is that they've highlighted a lot of interesting tension points. And it started off with quite a lot of name-calling on the part of the youth. I heard educated troublemakers. I think that the literature is interesting because it vilifies youth and it also victimizes youth as well. And what's interesting is that when youth are villainized, it shows the cause, but it doesn't show the effect. Or is it the other way around? What has caused youth to be perceived as villains? And it is the circumstances in which we find ourselves. We find ourselves in situations where we're fighting for the realization of our socioeconomic rights. We are looking for employment where there are no opportunities. We are looking for food where there's food insecurity. We're existing in a lot of conflict-affected regions around the world and across the continent. So we are vilified when we speak up. And we are victimized in that we exist in these circumstances and we are perceived as the most vulnerable. But I think that my job on this panel is to also show how youth are victors as well in our various contexts and how we also have the ability to be change agents in our communities. And a lot of the speakers have touched on the perceived or the actual youth bulge, basically that we have a more youthful population now, especially looking at the fact that Africa's population is going to increase in size. And the question is whether this is scary or not. And I'd like to reassure us that it is not scary. It just provides more opportunity for us to rewrite the status quo. And I intend to explain how youth are doing this across the continent. For starters, there are many youth groups that are doing virtual dialogues. We now exist in a plane where we have Instagram, we have Twitter, we have TikTok, we have Facebook, and the like. And so we are using any platform that we have to use these platforms for dialogue and multi-sectoral dialogues where we're inviting other practitioners in the civil society space, where we're inviting the media, where we're inviting activists, where we're inviting religious leaders and academia, psychologists, sociologists, to come and talk about how we can move forward. Instances of these types of dialogues have been held in Nigeria, for example. Youth have been utilizing the mechanism of sports to bring social cohesion. I can say that about civil society organizations in Cameroon doing the same. I could also talk about the WhatsApp groups that have been created that provide a space for youth to talk to one another all across the continent through the Youth for Peace in Africa platform, where now we're getting to link with other peace builders who are all across the continent. I can tell you about an organization in Botswana called Iboto that is curbing hate speech on the internet by teaching people how to speak to one another on the internet and online. I can tell you about artivism, using poetry, using music to reclaim our social identities as youth and as Africans. I can tell you about how we're using music and linking with people in Nigeria, people in Southern Africa, people in Botswana, people in Zambia to make art and to reclaim ourselves, and in this way building peace. And so I think these are stories of triumph, and maybe some of the challenges here that have been raised are, yes, that we don't have enough money to fund these brilliant initiatives that are happening all across the continent, but also that we need support in terms of capacity building, maybe even in terms of teaching youth about monitoring and evaluation so that we can actually measure the impact that we have on our communities, so that we can package it and so that we can spread it even further across the continent, so that we're not told that we are villains. And I think another issue is making our national government structures more accessible to youth. I think a recurrent problem is that the youth feel like they need people who are not youth to access these structures, when these structures need to be built to facilitate youth accessing it just as we are. And there's also an issue of lack of coordination in terms of facilitating more platforms where there's intergenerational dialogue. So I think these challenges then fall as opportunities. In terms of the assessment of the gaps in our international and regional frameworks in relation to youth, peace, and security, at the African level, we do have the AU Constitutive Act, which broadly speaks about peace and security and good governance, but it doesn't really talk about youth per se. We do also have Article 4C, I, and M of the Constitutive Act, which talk about participation of the African people, but it doesn't necessarily narrow down youth. So we seek refuge under the African Youth Charter, which speaks to youth participation in all areas or all spheres of the society, but not many countries have ratified this. So we see that there's a changing shift in our regional context in realizing that youth need to be brought forward more. This being acknowledged in the Agenda 2063 under aspiration number 6, I believe, or 7, and also in creating the Silencing of the Guns initiative, which was a flagship program under the very same agenda, which was driven by the first AU youth envoy. And this is another office that has been created as a step to introduce youth into the regional framework. And now we have different policies, the Continental Framework on Youth, Peace and Security, that have come to the fore and calling on governments to create national youth peace and security national plans, which Nigeria has done, and there's still opportunity for the rest of Africa to do and spearhead. So these are the places where we exist, but in terms of the gaps, I think as much as we have these beautiful policies, we really need to implement. There's the issue of having these national plans be created. This needs to be done, but also acknowledging the challenges that COVID-19 has posed to us and how we're able to move as youth in conducting our peace-building initiatives and exercises. And also, it would be a loss to not acknowledge the shrinking space for youth in the face of unconstitutional changes of government and general loss of confidence and trust in our governments. And there's also a gap in relation to our framework in terms of not looking or acknowledging mental health and psychosocial support in this mechanism. If you want us to be leaders of tomorrow, you have to ensure that we are healthy, not just physically, but also mentally in taking the continent forward. So what are the ways that we can actively engage youth in peace building as my concluding points in business unusual? Perhaps we could harness, first of all, having more funding for youth initiatives, and also creating more free spaces for youth to collaborate with one another. In my country, I'll give a typical example of a place where I ended up doing so much work from, a little nook in the Fairgrounds Mall called Incubate. And it's literally just a co-working space where youth sit together for free. There's coffee, there's internet, you work together, you collaborate, you synergize. So more spaces like that are really important. And also investing in access to the internet for free, and making sure that we end internet shutdowns, because this is where we predominantly are speaking right now. We can talk about peace curriculum in schools. That's extremely important and was touched on by Father. And we can also talk about creating more intergenerational dialogues at the national level. And we could also probably look at national service programs that maybe we should relook at them and reevaluate their content so that it builds a sense of strength for the youth in building and in creating identity, in being in confidently calling ourselves peace builders. So I think I'll end here.
Thank you very much. So I afforded Hamathuli an additional 2 minutes, and she didn't use it all up. Perhaps, audience, you can learn a thing or two from the youth among us. Thank you very much, Ramatuli, for that. Not only did you speak to some of the key challenges, including the language we use when speaking of young people, but you also identified some really important entry points for engagement on the African continent. In our conversation now, which when the event started in the spirit of only a dictator would, I prescribed how long the discussion would be. I do see a hand raised already. Be patient. I prescribed how long the discussion would be. It relied on the cooperation of our panelists. All three of them, Père Hyacinthe Lua, Dr. Agostinho Ting Mayai, and Ramatuli Isatu Jallow, did as they were expected to, even if there was a protestation from the far corner. That means the 50 minutes of discussion that I promised you starts now. There is exactly 50 minutes for discussion. So first, thank them. And then, when I afforded Ramatuli an additional 2 minutes, I heard protestations from a male voice. I could not see him, but I heard him, which means the first question for this session goes to Dr. Helen.
Thank you, sister. Darling sister. So my name is Helen Kezienwoha, and I work with the Women's International Peace Center based in Kampala in Uganda. Ramatu, thank you so much. I'm just going to add, to her conversation, because in the women, peace and security arena, we're also trying to say to ourselves, how are you mainstreaming youth, peace, and security? And I think that while it is something that youth should talk about, I think it should be mainstreamed in every other space, because youth should be part of all development processes, economy, wherever. But also to say to you that you actually moving far ahead of us, because we don't have a continental framework on women, peace, and security, but you do have a continental framework, which gives you more balancing in terms of national action plans, in terms of follow-up, in terms of accountability with the heads of state. But what we are worried about is what happened to us. Where do we situate the youth, peace, and security agenda at the national level? Not to allow it to be swept under some ministry and it loses significance and relevance, and then funding becomes a problem. So I think that we have to have a conversation around where do we locate it, and it has to be based on the country. Some countries are very good. They have a youth ministry. Some don't have. Some have women, youth, children, cows, and goats, together. So it becomes problematic for you to be able to profile youth within those. But at national level, we have a lot of institutions now, frameworks for youth councils. So how would you harness all of that, for you to be able to pull your youth peace and security agenda, including holding women peace and security agenda promoters accountable to youth peace and security, so that you don't lose it. But thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you very much. I note 2 hands on this side of the room. We're going to take one, the gentleman with the cap, and then we're going to come back to this side to Laure. I see you.
Well, next time I hope I'll be given chairmanship so that I can exercise dictatorial tendencies. Anyway, that takes into my question. I think, thank you so much. That was very interesting. It made me cheer up this afternoon. Most of the time we tend to sleep in the panels. But then I think my question goes to the fact that
please introduce yourself.
I'm the gentleman with the cap.
Yes, we would like your government name and the institution you're affiliated with.
My name
please.
is Fred from Rongo University.
Thank you.
Yeah, so, and that eats into my time again, you know, so I think I do want to beseech you to allow me to ask the questions. Yeah?
The less you complain and focus on your question, the quicker we'll get through.
Yeah, so my question is this. The discourse, the conceptualization of the idea of the youth is an exclusionary discourse designed to marginalize those, within the boundaries of a bracket, youth bracket. I mean, they say it's in between 18 to 34 years, they say, you know. I see that as an exclusionary discourse designed to delay youth potential and also hell-bent at consoling those who have not made it outside of that bracket and therefore divert responsibility for those who are supposed to support youth potential and youth initiative. What is your comment about that?
Thank you very much. Please, if you can pass the microphone to Lortal across the room.
Thank you to the panelists. I am Lortal from IPAR Senegal. I have a two-folded question. The first one is about youth. When you were talking and describing facts and reflection about youth, I was only hearing young men. Where are the young women in this narrative? My second question is about the future. You gave us a lot of very interesting and sometimes hard facts on the situation of youth in Africa. But what is the future and what is their position in this future? Because they will not be young forever. So what is the future that we are thinking of for them? Or what is the future that they are willing for themselves? And how do we get there? So I missed a little bit about future.
Thank you very much. To people that are going to be posing questions going forward, please pull a big leaf out of the book that Helen, Laure, Dr. Fred have started with. All three of their questions were to the point, so please follow suit. We'll have time now for a fourth in this round. If everyone goes in that way, we'll actually have time for everyone in this room to speak. So, for now, we will have 4 questions to Getachew. And then I've noted additional hands that have come up. We will have time for those in the next round. And if we stick to that, we might even have 10 of these.
Thank you very much, Olia. I also appreciate the panelists for coming up with the burning issues of the youth in Africa.
You are?
I'm Getachew from the African Institute of Governance and Development of Ethiopian Civil Service University. I have 2 questions, and the first one goes to Father Liua. I think you raised about the issue of youth vulnerability. In fact, that is the reality in Africa. Youth are exposed to migration, youth are exposed to recruitment of rebels, terrorist groups, and so on. As a father, as affiliated to religion, what's your advice, especially for the youth Africa and the government in Africa? The second one is related to the presentation of Augustine and that of Ramatulia, associated with APSA, the APSA issues, African Youth Charter. Do you think this is really a guarantee for peace for the youth, taking into account the behavior of African governments? You remember about silence of gun, and then which 2020, no silence as such. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. To the panelists, you've been asked questions related to effective ways of mainstreaming the creation of specific space for the youth, while at the same time the idea that identifying the youth is in itself exclusionary. You've been asked about the space for young women, and a very good question, Laure, around the future of the young. I often like to say, particularly in some countries where the youth age keeps going up and up, that just because you were young once doesn't mean you're forever youth. Then Getachew on vulnerability and whether the African peace and security architecture provides a guarantee for the youth. To respond to these questions, we will go in reverse order in the manner in which the panelists spoke. So Ramatuli, you will go first, afterwards Agostino, and then finally Père Hyacinthe. And then those of you whose hands I have already noted, the second round of questions will be coming up soon, if the panelists oblige.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the questions. I think I'd like to start with Fred's question or comment around youth being an exclusionary discourse. I found that interesting because whilst reading, I came across the research of Dr. Owale, I believe, under King's College University, and he was talking about the interesting factor about how we don't define youth in all of our countries uniformly. Some countries have extended youth to way past 35, and some have gone as far as 40. I think the example was Mali. Some have gone a bit slim fit, and have gone from 18 to maybe 30. So it varies. And also in his work, he talked about how the reason why that might be so is because of youth being linked with a sense of dependence. And the question was whether the dependence carries on even after 30, 35, going to 40, which I found very interesting. I think that it is, in a way, singling out youth like that, it's complicated, it's complex, it's hard, but I think that we're trying to put youth at the forefront to show how they can be helped and how they can be strengthened and how they can be recognized and how they can be given a platform. And you can't do that without identifying who the youth are. So it's a very interesting question, and maybe there might be room for harmonizing the definition of youth. Maybe that would be interesting at a continental level. But I think ultimately the reason why we want youth as a standalone subset is because we want to address them as they are. And I think that then carries into the point of how do we marry the intersection between youth and women, peace and security? Because these are two groups that coexist together, whether we like it or not. In fact, I coexist in that very cross section. And what's interesting is that earlier this year, I had just completed a study about civil society organizations, women and women-led CSO organizations, how young women and older senior women in the space of peace building collaborate together with one another. And it was very interesting to hear the opinions of older women versus the opinions of youth and how they could synergize. But I think the common narrative from the youth were that older women needed to give space and to allow for the dynamicism that youth bring. At the same time, youth having the humility to be guided by senior women in the space as well. So maybe if I take that understanding and place it now in our national context, what does that look like? Sure, we might have a separate ministry for youth, and maybe we might have a separate ministry for women. I think most importantly is about removing bureaucracy so that there can be more collaboration. I think that's the most important thing. And so how do we do that? By making sure that if we're going to create a National Youth Council, that the question of women representation is still alive in that context as well, even when you're talking about youth. And also providing more platforms for intergenerational dialogues between youth and maybe the Ministry of Gender, as the case may be in the case of women, more dialogue. I think another way can be through, especially at the civil society roots, I think there could be a mapping that can take place, because often youth coming into the space, they feel blind. They go into the space feeling, and it being blind sometimes. Sometimes you don't know who to approach. You don't know who has the requisite skills. So I think what's important is having that mapping and having that pairing, so that you have the strengths of the youth and strengths of women that then merge and come together. I know that it doesn't completely answer the question, but perhaps it could be a start. And then there was another comment about, about what the future for youth looks like as well in this whole discussion about the intersection between women, youth, and basically what is the dream for youth going forward. I think ideally noting that youth are a big factor in our demographic in Africa right now. I think the whole idea is dismantling structures that are not youth friendly, and rather having structures that accommodate youth and that include youth and that are led by youth and that also can be spearheaded by youth. So I think that should be what the future looks like, that we collaborate and give space. It's like a relationship in a way. Where youth have the ability to participate, whether we're looking at youth in parliament. For example, the case that comes to mind is Botswana having one of the youngest female ministers of trade, and also Namibia doing the same. So including women and youth in those contexts to drive conversations forward, so that we are given the space to dream and plan for our future instead of having other people plan it for us. Then there was also there was a comment about religion, and then there was a comment about the APSA and the Youth Charter, whether these are guarantees of centering youth in basically the African Peace and Security Framework. And my answer to that is no, it's not a guarantee at all. Words on a page are just words on a page if they're not implemented. So what we really need is the political will to really, and that also, I know political will is very elusive because it's like the answer to everything is political will, but it seems, I think that's something that we need and something that can be driven by a sense of urgency from youth, to show that we're active, we're here on the ground, and that we need these structures. And I think another interesting structure that I didn't mention in the presentation was the creation of the Youth Peace and Security Ambassadors that are in all 5 regions of Africa. I think that's a pretty good initiative as well, to make sure that there's a connection. There's slowly you can see that the AU is trying to get closer and closer to the ground, which I think is commendable, but it's just that it is a young project and there's still more that needs to be done. So I think with that, those would be my comments.
Thank you very much. Agostino?
Thank you very much. Very insightful questions and comments. Ramatuli has actually presented much of what I will say. What I'll do here is reinforce what she has said, and I'll look at this from 2 perspectives. One is being the frameworks and strategies that are used by different entities to basically cater to the lot of the youth. In the African context. And as she said, the problem is it's not the presence or the construction of those strategies or frameworks. The issue actually lies in the implementation of those strategies. And I come from South Sudan, where there are more laws than there are in any of the regional countries. And some of you have read about the conditions in South Sudan would think there are no laws in the country, right? It's because they are not implemented. We have beautiful laws that are out there. This applies to not just South Sudan, but also regional and continental as well as international frameworks. And this brings me to this question that I would like to ask all of you. Are we not practicing? Because we continue to produce all these strategies over and over again. Are we not practicing what Einstein said? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, it's basically insanity. So that's my answer to the two questions raised by Dr. Allen and, of course, Dr. Fred. Now, the place for young people in this frameworks, or more generally, and I'll bring an example from South Sudan. So young people are the majority. And so the future of the country lies with being able to manage the decisions, right, that drive the country forward. Where does that sit? It sits at the political level. And in South Sudan, young people do not access political offices. And so what young people have done is actually to redraw their constituencies. So I've just turned 40, and I have left youth programming about 10 or so years ago because I thought that's the right thing to do. Well, some of my peers are going back. And so youth programs in South Sudan right now are led by people my age. And they are basically sitting on the real youth because they have been sat on by these are the big youth. Right? And there's now a saying that there's something called the senior youth in South Sudan. And it's happening because structurally, young people are made to not move. And so you would have to create an opportunity for yourself where perhaps you can be relevant. And so what this says in the context of my recommendations, which I did not present earlier, because men are not like that here, is that the policy on youth development should actually be refocused towards recognizing that the African youth are a blessing to their societies. And you go locally, that's what people will say. That's what my grandma would say. Young people are not the problem. Problem lies elsewhere. And so if you properly direct them towards or use their energies properly, you should be able to spur, for example, economic growth. And that you need to invest in them through educational opportunities and skills generating opportunities. But it doesn't end there. You need to build economies, right, which deliver to them. And you need to broaden the economic base so young people can have access to this. Now, let me get to the last one, and that's conceptualizing the youth. So a few years ago, a friend of mine is now here. His name is Peter Biar. Came up with an agenda called the generational exit. And his intention was that whoever is leading the country right now, including their grandma's, got to leave. The next chance belongs to the young people. And he was jailed for 2 years. And so what this really says is the environment is very difficult to be able to advance these ideas of youth being relevant and having to participate and having to do more about the country, because without that political leadership that and political will she spoke about, there will be challenges. So perhaps the business and usual should be how we deal with the political leaderships.
Thank you very much. Pierre Hyacinthe.
So thank you very much. As you know, I will not repeat what they said. I would like, as I said, to say something about my own experience. I went to the north of Côte d'Ivoire, and we were working on the jihadism at that place. And we met one of them. My question was, what did you do in order to have many young people with you everywhere? And he looked at me and said, Father, give them job. I said, oh. And when I came back and when listening to those people, it's good to talk about the political will, yes. I think the real problem here, if we have to change, as you ask, what can we do in order to change? Even the change, the idea we have on the youth, when we say that the youth are drivers of a conflict or they are creators of instability. Yeah, you can see many things. But if a youth is well educated, if we create a job, do you think that people will come and manipulate them? Then if we say that we need a political will, the political will be how can we give a good training to our youth and then a job. And I say I didn't give my conclusion. The conclusion was a peaceful country gives people the opportunity to work well and promote its economic growth. And so I say, therefore, we all here, we should be peacemakers because we should help youth to have at least what they need in order to live. But if I know, like, I don't have anything to eat, someone was talking about a hungry man, and you come to me and say, Lua, okay, I will give you 1 million francs CFA and come with me in the forest. What will I do? My parents are poor, and I don't have money. I don't even know where to get food today. And I will tell you that it's the way now those people we call jihadists in the North Africa, it's the way they are taking our youth. And when I say youth, our young people, they are men and women, because most of them are not, they don't have what to eat or what they need in order to live. So I will stop here and say, let us educate, create job, and help our youth to be peacemakers.
Thank you very much to all three panelists. We do have one question so far from the online audience, which is that a common theme is that youth are members of community. But are they really? It is not uncommon for community villages and urban neighborhoods to routinely exclude many youth. To the panelists, please, if you can comment on this. And then Mziwandile, you had your hand raised. Please, you can pose your question. And then after Eugenia, and then Père Rigobert Minani. Mziwandile is right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Mziwandile Ndlovu. I work with the African Institute for Development Policy. My question to all the panelists really is, what are the peace and security risks of having what Augustino characterized as the educated troublemakers? This constituency of young people where the dire situation is that even those with postgraduate education are really struggling to find opportunities to build a career. What are the actual peace and security risks? Are we seeing a risk of young people, decently educated, being recruited into terrorist networks or starting to lead vigilante groups, fostering all sorts of forms of social disorder as is starting to happen in South Africa? What are the critical risks of having educated people being as idle as they are on the continent? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eugenia.
Thank you very much, moderator. My name is Eugenia Kaitesi. I come from Rwanda. I head the Institute of Policy Analysis and Research. I wanted to come on the issue that was raised by, she mentioned that youth should be actually included in all structures. And I wanted to comment on the saying that youth, we always say that youth are leaders of tomorrow. And I know our youth have refused, and they say they are leaders of today, so that they should be included in leadership. And actually, it's not a question, it's a comment. Youth are able. They are able to really be part of it, to be integrated in every part of the national development. And there's also a notion that the youth they think that they should lead the youth ministries, women ministries. But I can draw an example from Rwanda where we have young people leading most ministries. I can cite that we have the Ministry of Technology, Ministry of Sports, Ministry of Youth. All these are led by very young people, and they're very, very effective. So I want to encourage everyone in the room that let's include the youth. And again, I wanted to say on saying that youth should be able to create their jobs, that they should be job creators, not job seekers. The youth, this is also a saying that excludes them from the national development programs. One youth said that these old people should be the ones to come out of jobs and go and create, their own jobs so that the youth should lead. So I see that youth are part of the development. It's a resource that we shouldn't actually put on the side. So let's just get youth as part of our people and a part of the national development. It's a source that we should all exploit in our countries. Thank you very much. It's not a question. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for that useful input and comment. As said right at the start, not everything that you say during this discussion has to be a question to the panel. We are in conversation. Please, if you can go to Père Hyacinthe, and then after that, Faith, who is right in front of him.
Yeah, my name is...
Higo Beminani, sorry.
Yeah, it's the same.
He's so close to me.
Yeah.
And you're both Jesuits.
So I would like to link the question of peace and security. And in my context, the question of peace is linked directly to elections, and security is linked to arms group and gangs. So I'm very sympathetic to Agostino when you say that the student, the intellectual, the troublemakers. I would like to have these troublemakers today. The first time I was arrested, I was in university, first year of university. I don't find these people anymore. Anyway,
Père Minani, not to interject here, but just for clarity and for the record, did you say you were a troublemaker?
Yes, yes, truly. And I would like to have them at the university today. My experience is this. I work with, my program obliged me to men of my, those I work at youth. I have 3 categories for youth. I have the intellectual, the students. These have become, they are very good in social media, but don't send them in the street. They don't know how to behave. So sometimes for what I have to do, they are useless. And then I have those who are in the gangs. Most of them not educated, but they know how to resist to police brutality. These are my commandos. And then I have those who are in political parties, because we have a program also of youth in political parties. We have them in CEPAS. These are opportunists. They're waiting opportunity to be leaders and to behave like our people. So, Ramatuli, can you tell me, how do you, because I put you in the first category, the good girls, universities, they know to read and write, they can speak English and French. So can you tell me, how do you address the second group, those who I meet in the gangs, those who I meet in rebel groups? And this is the people who make the difference. Because when there is to make the difference, you use those ones. Politicians, they use those ones. Yason Tulwa is there. I went with him in Bamako to do research on jihadism. Yes. Those who challenges are there. They were not intellectuals. They were people coming from these bushes. So, Ramatuli, can you tell me, what do you do for those ones? Thank you.
Thank you very much. If all the audience will remember, Père Minani said that he was a troublemaker. What he is asking, Ramatuli, is, if you were there when I was in university, how would you have addressed me? Of course not, I'm joking. Faith?
Yeah, I'm going to be very quick. My name is Faith from the Institute for Global Dialogue in Pretoria. Any of the panelists can answer this. I mean, you can. It will give you time to think. So the question is, I'm sure you've come across the concept of waithood that was popularized by Alcindor Honwana, who was saying that a lot of the youth in Africa are caught in this period of stagnancy between adolescence and adulthood, and then they struggle with attaining the markers of adulthood. And it's actually the waithood concept that has been sort of taken on board by the policymakers in framing the discourse and some of the responses. The question is, in the case that we are looking at in the interest of promoting the theme of this conference, right, which is business unusual, what would you advise policymakers and also practitioners who are out to harness the latent potential of the youth, how to make peace building sexy again for the youth, tap into that latent potential that we've been talking about all afternoon? That's B. So the messaging here is what I'm looking for. How do you turn around the concept of waithood and turn it into an enabling concept rather than a constraining concept? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one final question. There.
Thank you. My name is Nyandeng Verona Gajang. I'm a governance specialist with the World Bank, and I come from Eastern Africa. I say Eastern Africa because I'm from South Sudan natively. I was born in Ethiopia and grew up in Uganda. So pretty much I would say I am an ambassador of youth because I'm 26 years old. My question is around the growing population in Africa. Particularly, we can use the Ugandan example and also economic growth. While I was listening, it came off to me as though the fact that we come from a continent where people are fertile is an issue, when in actuality the issue are the conditions that these children that are being birthed are born into. So it would be very good to have a clear understanding on how we don't somewhat maybe indirectly target women as the people that are birthing children to these conditions, and being able to understand how these children are born into conditions that are elevated and also are enabling to be able to move forward in not just a thriving community, but they can also contribute to spaces whereby the next generation is able to thrive as well. So this is a question to everyone, but particularly Dr. Agostino, as you are an expert on this, it would be good to understand the intersectionality and also how this separates from not looking at fertility and the population growth in Africa as an issue, because these children are not necessarily a burden. These conditions that they are born into are the issues that they get to deal with, and we get to deal with those as well. So as you understand, Dr. Agostino, most of us come from refugee backgrounds, people whose parents fled war, but these issues are some that we grow up to try and tackle, but it takes so long, and it just builds the picture that you are not the problem as someone that has been born as a result of fertility, or that we have to continue to reproduce as human beings, but rather the conditions that are in place. So it would be good to have some sort of a clear understanding, recommendations, what you think the leaders should approach differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time flies when you're having an important conversation about youth inclusion, Fred, not exclusion. So we really only have about 13 minutes left to this event. To my panelists, no names, who thought that 8 minutes was too short, the challenge is to you now to respond to the various issues that have been raised on exclusion of youth and communities, the lack of opportunities lending themselves to conditions conducive to violence, youth as being able people. This was a comment, but you can also respond to it. And the importance of establishing means for peace and security. How do you address troublemakers, not like the good father in our present, but the bad troublemakers? How do you harness the latent potential and make peace building sexy again, not in a Trumpian way, but in a productive way? How do you improve conditions for development such that whether or not a woman has 10 children or 1, it doesn't matter, because all those children have equal opportunities? But because Père Binani spoke to it already, there will always be some rabble-rousers, some troublemakers, some people that after you say this is the final comment will slyly raise their hand and say, just a small comment. I will give the opportunity for Dr. Vuyo Mjimba, who did just that, to give his very brief comment before I hand over to the panel for their final responses and reflections. Please, the microphone.
say is not going to be nice. I'm going to ask a very difficult question to the youth.
Question or comment?
Whatever. So you raised your hand to say I'm going to make a comment.
Yeah.
I do engage the youth. Let me just say, as the senior youth, I'm tired.
You're very generous.
I'm tired of the youth complaining. Give us a chance, give us a chance. Yes. Who gave us the chance? You. We were never given a chance. We took the chance. Let me tell you why. The senior youth to me fought for democracy. I'm part of the group of black youth that first went into the former white school. The father just dumped you there and you were subjected to serious racism from the student and the teachers. I fought it. Now you want to tell me in my 50s to quit my job and leave it to you, who has never organized anything, in my view. I'm not going to do that. We confronted the youth with... hold on, let me finish my last point. We confronted the Fees Must Fall youth in South Africa with Jonathan Jensen. I've never in my life had so many confident loud mouths that have no substance in the last part. I'm very serious. Because other than wanting free education, they had no solution how the money was going to be generated. And they were there. So youth, come in there in a world where I spoke about innovation in the morning. If your idea is supreme and the product you bring is supreme, it is going to overtake mine. If your mouth is big, but your idea is not there, you will complain until I retire at 75. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That being said, no. Thank you very much. Because of Dr. Vuyo Mjimbe's input, panelists, you have each 2 minutes to address all the ranging questions. If you do have a challenge with the limited time that has been given to you, please, you have noted the gentleman who delayed your responses. You can meet him outside the room after. So now, the first to speak, Père Hyacinthe, you have the floor to respond.
I would like to come on his comment. I will not say that it's a question because from my side, the side of SERAP, when we are training our youth and we ask them to be free and to be, not to depend on someone, but to get job, okay? Even we give them a training that will help them to create jobs. And that's why we take time to train them. But I understand what you are saying. The youth are not just there waiting for the elders to give them job. No, but they have to work hard. That's why we need to train them. That's why I said also that we need to change the context in which those people are living. The youth are living, not even not the context, but the idea we have. The narrative we develop on the youth, we have to change it. Who will change it? That's why we say when we are training them, we always ask them to go back to their own culture and see the way their parents were living together and what happened, why they are not living together. And we train them. That's why I say we create a space where they can come together and discuss and to understand what is happening. That we use really the mind in order to go ahead in this context. I think to help youth, as I said, we need to educate them. When I say education, is more than training, is more that you follow them and you help them to be men and women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To help the youth, education. To you, Agostinho, your last thoughts and reflections on the questions that have been posed. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'll address two questions. The question on peace and security risk associated with educating or over-educating young people, it's in place. And this is also linked to whether or not these individuals are recruited by other forces. What I do know is that in most cases, these guys actually lead their own organizations. John Garang is a good example in the context of South Sudan. He was educated here in Iowa, got his education, went back to South Sudan and caused a lot of trouble. Created South Sudan out of that. Thomas Sankara is another good example. As a matter of fact, Osama bin Laden is one of those examples. And so they will create their own institutions, and they will cause problems in a society. And like the guys on the street who are most likely to be co-opted by folks like John Garang, for example, and taken for a fight. So, so that's what we know so far. Nyandeng, your question on population growth, economic growth, and the fact that children are born into problems and not necessarily them being a problem, it's on point. Except that as demographers, we think even in stable societies, economically stable societies, more children are a problem. And here's why. As you have 5 kids, you have 2 jobs, you are to educate them. My daughter now is going to school and costs me $9,000 a semester. Think of 5 of them. You just cannot afford them. And so economically, it's still a problem, even if you are stable economically. So there would be need for us to reduce fertility. Fertility in Uganda is about 7 kids. Right? It's extremely high in that context. So they are not necessarily a problem if you have economic stability, but your resources will be limited. And that means you cannot educate them. And if you cannot educate them sufficiently, then what do? They get to the street, they get recruited by guys who are educated and happy with the system, and they cause problems for the society. And the cycle continues. So in a way, you can look at it from that 2 angles perspective where, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. And then finally, Hamatu.
I'll try and collect the questions that were not addressed. But I would really like to address the comment that was given at the end about youth taking the chance instead of waiting to be spoon-fed. I think to some extent, feedback definitely taken. I think that that's something that came up in the recent study that I had done, that in intergenerational linkages between youth and also non-youth, that youth need to come to the space prepared. But I think that mostly what I see, and maybe I'm privileged in my space, is that I see very well-equipped youth. And I think that the issue is that just because I think that progressively we have to be working towards developing. We have to be moving towards things getting better. Because my father made fire using 2 stones doesn't mean that I shouldn't use matches, doesn't mean that I shouldn't use a stove. We have to progressively be getting better. So as youth, that I am confident that we appear well prepared and equipped in the space, so too we should continue to advocate for better inclusion and ease in accessing these structures. So it's a 2-pronged. Okay, and then quickly, there was the issue of youth being excluded. And I think that brings about the issue of intersectionality, which is really where we should have begun as well. Looking at youth as a diverse group, looking at youth as women, looking at youth as sex workers, looking at youth as people with disabilities, looking at youth as LGBT youth. These are all conversations that we have to have in terms of our communities taking youth exactly as we appear and as we are. And these are issues to do with education, mindset change, but also just allowing youth to engage freely in the space so that we can provide more to the space authentically is really important. There was a comment about making peace building sexy again. I think how I fell in love with this field is because it's so broad. You can talk about development, you can talk about trade, you can talk about entrepreneurship, you can talk about art, you can talk about drama. So I think you can talk about tech. So I think that's the sexiness appeal for me, that under peace building, you could be absolutely anything. And recognizing that peace building is so nuanced that it can even be about creating platforms, bringing strangers together and cooking food together, and it opening your eyes to somebody in a different context. That is a form of peace building. And so I think it's also for us to understand that we need to maybe dig deeper in finding out or exploring what we mean by peace building and centering ourselves in that and playing in that space. So I think that's how peace building can be made sexy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Over the course of the past hour and a half, you have heard from 15 different voices. 11 of the voices you heard from are representatives of organizations from the Southern Voices Network for Peace Building. If our task in this session was to hear as many people, different takes, different themes around one topic, I hope with the help of our panel and all of you, we were able to do that. Over the past 4 days, the Southern Voices Network for Peace Building members have been engaged in rigorous discussions, both public and private, on key issues related to peace building in Africa, with a view that we can think outside of the box or break the box apart. And Business Unusual allows us to have those reflections. Who are the Southern Voices for Network for Peace Building? Represented in this room are the African Center for Economic Transformation, the African Institute for Development Policy, the African Technology Policy Studies Network, the Center for Democratic Development, the Center for Media, Democracy, Peace and Security, the Center for Policy Studies, le Centre d'études pour l'action sociale, le Centre de recherche et d'action pour la paix, the Center for Conflict Management, le Centre Ivoirien de Recherche Économique et Sociale, the Human Sciences Research Council, the Initiative for Public Policy Analysis, the Initiative for Perspective Agricole et Rural, c'est en français, the Institute for Global Dialogue, the Institute for Peace and Security Studies, my organization, the Institute for Security Studies, the Institute for Policy Analysis and Research Rwanda, Women's International Peace Center, the SADC Institute, the SUD Institute, the University of Pretoria Department of Political Science, the West African Network for Peace Building. We are all brought together here in Washington, D.C. by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars Africa Program. That is who we are. The conversations you've heard today and over the past 4 days is precisely who we also are and what we do. But importantly, all the organizations, and I took care to list all of them in alphabetical order, when we leave DC for the next 12 months and years to come, we will all go back to our work, which is aimed at peace building in Africa through economy, trade, development, peace and security, social action, agriculture, dialogue, policy analysis, tangible engagement with women, youth, men, all people from Africa. And I'm saying this now because this is our last public session. So to our online audience and to those of you who came into this room, with apologies from the chair, the session was 1 hour, 33 minutes. You all know who you should or should not blame, but I apologize on their behalf. Please do enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Network members, we do have a break now and then a public or private session at 3:30 if my memory serves me correctly.